Hi, and welcome back to another in my series of videos on the Gospel of John. This time, we're finally going to be leaving behind the Book of Signs, the first 12 chapters of John, and turning a page to begin moving toward the cross, begin looking at the way Jesus prepares his disciples for his departure and for life afterwards. At the start of chapter 13, we stand at the watershed of John's Gospel. We've just emerged from the Book of Signs. Those first 12 chapters of the book focused on Jesus' public announcement of his identity and the varied responses that announcement provoked. Jesus made his announcement with words, but those words were supported by signs, demonstrations of God's power. Jesus' announcement was also seconded, John claims, by John the Baptist and by Moses himself if we read the Pentateuch with fresh eyes. But it's Jesus' signs that demonstrate above anything else that he has come from God. He is the source of eternal life, the new quality of life that belongs to the age to come. The Book of Signs recorded and amplified on Jesus' claim, showed us the signs, and explored why some rejected Jesus' light anyway, while others embraced him with trust. Along the way, John used the symbolism of Israel's sacred times to imply that Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's worship. He is, for John, the new tabernacle, the site where God can be met face to face. And at the same time, he's bringing the new Exodus, the liberation from slavery to death and confusion that was anticipated in Israel's festivals. Some have trusted him, encountered the Father in him, and begun to experience the liberation of the new age. Others have refused and chosen to remain in the darkness. All this culminated in chapter 12 when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem for the Passover, amid foreshadowings of his death, and then disappeared from the public eye. Once we cross the watershed at the start of chapter 13, everything is focused on Jesus' impending death. As we've seen before, some scholars treat the whole second half of John's Gospel as one section, a book of glory to match the earlier Book of Signs. And there's something to that. But structurally and thematically, chapters 13 to 17 still stand out as a distinct stage in the Gospel. Before rushing on to Jesus' arrest and death, John makes us pause and linger in private with Jesus and his followers as he tries to prepare them for his departure. The whole farewell scene takes place during one meal, shared by Jesus and his disciples on that last night before his arrest. We're in a private room with just Jesus and his closest circle, reclining on benches around a table, talking by lamplight about the darkness that's about to overtake Jesus and the light that will continue shining through it. The scale of events has abruptly changed in chapter 13. We've suddenly shifted into a lower gear. The whole Book of Signs ran along at a good narrative clip, rarely spending more than half a chapter on a single day, and often racing between places and different days several times within a section. If anything, this narrative pace accelerated in chapter 12 as we sped from Mary washing Jesus' feet to the plot against Lazarus, to Jesus' triumphal entry, to his meeting with the Greeks. Most scenes have unfolded in front of ever-changing crowds, and the few private encounters with Jesus have quickly given way to public signs and speeches again. With chapter 13, though, it's like time suddenly shifts into extreme slow motion. This is like the moment in a movie when we freeze and linger in anticipation over the catch of the hero's breath, stretching out that moment before, say, the kiss or the gunshot that we know is about to come. And like in those cinematic moments, here the camera pulls in close to focus just on the key players in the drama. Around them might be crowds and chaos, but the camera catches the private intimacy of this moment, this held breath. This is John's farewell scene. The focus of the Book of Signs was outward, facing the crowds and the world. Here the focus turns inward, to the struggles and needs of the disciples, who already form a little community around Jesus. Here, for the first time in John, Jesus offers ethical teaching, guidance about how they should live now that they're a community of his followers. Jesus is also focused on equipping the disciples to withstand the pressures they'll face when he dies. In this sense, John's farewell scene seems to be modeled after the Jewish genre of the Testament, not in the sense of Old Testament or New Testament. A Jewish testament was rather a literary form in which a revered leader gave his children or heirs a final series of instructions just before his death. It was a leader's way of taking care of his family even after he died, preparing them with the knowledge and determination to face the future. So here, Jesus offers his testament to his adopted family of disciples. He warns them that they'll face opposition and hatred. He encourages them, though, that they'll be equipped by God to carry on anyway. And perhaps what's most striking about the whole farewell scene is how much Jesus is focused on his disciples' emotions. He knows that when he leaves, they'll naturally feel abandoned, alone, confused and afraid, and he does more than just tell them that they're up to the challenge. Jesus also helps them to understand the depth and reality of the relationship they've established with him. Jesus is going away, but he's not really leaving them. They'll remain attached to Jesus and his life like branches to a vine. And through the Holy Spirit, Jesus will continue to be present with them, even though he's returned to the Father. Structurally, chapter 13 serves as a narrative introduction to the dialogue and speeches that follow. So we often reserve the title Farewell Discourse just for chapters 14 to 17. But this also means that we need to pay attention to how chapter 13 sets up and frames the discourse that follows. How does chapter 13 prime our attention, encouraging us to focus on certain themes and tensions in the following speeches? The farewell discourse itself also falls naturally into at least 3 large sections. Chapter 14 seems to be a self-contained dialogue with Jesus' disciples, ending with Jesus calling the disciples to get up and leave the meal. As we saw early on in this series of lessons, chapter 14 may well have been the original farewell discourse in a first edition of John's Gospel, since the following discourse material seems to continue awkwardly after the apparent closing line at the end of chapter 14. This original nucleus of the discourse also contains most of the ideas and themes that are developed and expanded on in the chapters that follow. I'll call this Jesus' Farewell Part 1. Chapters 15 and 16 then expand on this nucleus, likely adding related discourse material from John's teaching tradition that his students thought would complement and flesh out chapter 14. I'll call this Jesus' Farewell Part 2. Finally, as with most Jewish Testament scenes, Jesus ends with an extended prayer in chapter 17 for the adopted family he's leaving behind. With that prayer, the farewell discourse and the farewell scene as a whole comes to a close as Jesus gathers his disciples and goes out to face his arrest. For the moment, though, we're going to focus on the introduction to John's farewell scene in chapter 13. One of the things we often miss here, coming from the Synoptic Gospels, is that the meal that begins in this chapter isn't the Passover meal. The so-called Last Supper in the Synoptics is set up explicitly as a Passover meal. Here in John, though, there's no reference to eating the Passover. The chapter begins instead by locating the events before the festival of the Passover in 13 verse 1. Exactly how we might harmonize this tension is up for debate, assuming that we feel it's necessary. Historically, Jesus does seem to have shared a significant final meal with his disciples. In theory, it might have been a Seder of sorts, but eaten a day early, before the Passover had actually started. If so, John deliberately plays down the significance of that meal, even as he reminds us that we're back in a Passover context. Why? Because for John, Jesus himself will die shortly as the Passover lamb par excellence. The Passover meal that his disciples will eat will be his body and blood. So as chapter 13 opens and the farewell scene begins, We have to remember that this isn't, for the fourth evangelist, about instituting the Eucharist or eating a Passover meal. This is about preparing the disciples to digest the very strange Passover they're about to celebrate when they see the cross. A few unmistakable themes dominate the chapter, and two are introduced right in the first verse. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from the world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The focus falls squarely here on the imminent departure of Jesus. This is, of course, a coded reference to his coming crucifixion and death. Jesus is going somewhere the disciples can't follow, at least not right away. Along with this departure, John highlights the love of Jesus for the disciples. In broad, abstract terms, Jesus' death on the cross can be depicted as an expression of God's love for the world, and that's clearly how John understands it. Here, though, John stresses how that love for the world includes a very personal love of Jesus for his own, for the individual men and women who belong to him. This love isn't just a matter of actions, it's also a genuine affection felt by Jesus for these people who have followed him through thick and thin. It's the kind of human affection that we saw Jesus feel for Lazarus in chapter 11. Jesus sees the disciples in this farewell scene as individuals, and he empathizes with the confusion that his death is going to cause. Jesus feels with them the sense of abandonment at being left behind by this man for whom they've given up everything. In chapter 6, Peter spoke for the few disciples who remained with Jesus at that stage. "Where will we go? You have the words of eternal life." But now they're going to be left without his presence, unable to follow. So this chapter and the whole farewell scene are about Jesus caring for these men and women, taking responsibility for them as his own, being a good shepherd, and making sure they can weather what he knows is coming. It's also in this chapter that John first mentions the figure of the beloved disciple, the disciple Jesus loves. That figure appears in verse 23, reclining against Jesus at the dinner. Their close physical contact reflects, for a first century audience, the ideal intimate friendship of teacher and disciple, a kind of intimate platonic friendship that we sometimes fail to grasp in modern North America, where intimacy of all kinds is so often sexualized. The beloved disciple is probably John himself, but he also models the kind of personal closeness and affectionate trust that John believes Jesus wants with all disciples. At the same time, the chapter stresses Jesus' call for the disciples to imitate his love for them. The focus isn't so much on loving Jesus back, that's already assumed. Rather, Jesus begins to stress that being one of his own means imitating his kind of love and demonstrating it towards other human beings. Finally, Jesus' care for the disciples in chapter 13 is made all the more poignant by the repeated theme of the intimate betrayals he's about to suffer. Even as Jesus stands up to begin washing the disciples' feet, we're told how the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And as soon as he explains the meaning of that humble foot washing, Jesus begins talking about Judas' betrayal. Until finally, the betrayer is identified and leaves the intimate table to sell out his master. Jesus still doesn't appear as a passive victim, but neither is he stoic and detached. When he tells the circle in verse 21 that one of them will betray him, John tells us that Jesus was troubled in spirit. His personal love for his own means that he's genuinely vulnerable to the pain of Judas' betrayal. Neither are the other disciples all that reliable. Peter doesn't understand Jesus' act of foot washing, and in his lack of understanding, Peter resists him. The chapter then ends with Peter's naive declaration of loyalty to Jesus, who responds by predicting that Peter too will soon betray him. So Jesus' love is given in this chapter to very fallible followers. Some will betray him to his enemies, Others will just falter and deny him. And yet, Jesus opens himself to them in affectionate love. Structurally, chapter 13 is kind of hard to divide into neat sections, but most scholars agree that the chapter unfolds in at least two broad stages. First, in verses 1 to 17, we have the scene where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. This act really dominates the whole chapter and frames the farewell discourse as a whole. Then verses 18 to 30 focus on Judas and the beginning of his betrayal. Scholars disagree about exactly how to subdivide these sections, and some outlines will have a transitional section in between, but the basic sequence is fairly clear. Many then see a third section beginning after Judas leaves the dinner in verse 31. There, Jesus echoes the foot-washing scene with a general command that his disciples must love one another. And this is followed at the chapter's end with the prediction of Peter's betrayal. So verses 31 to 38 offer sort of a brief closing restatement of the chapter's intertwined themes: Jesus' departure, his love, and his disciples' betrayal. Of these sections, the foot-washing scene in verses 1 to 17 is both the most familiar to modern Christians and the most challenging to understand. Jesus gets up from the table, kneels down, and washes each disciple's feet. This is often interpreted as a demonstration of humility or of loving service, and both of these elements are there in Jesus' act. But I think we often miss how Jesus chooses here not only to serve his friends humbly, but to do it in a deliberately disturbing and disorienting way. Jesus' act deliberately breaks the social scripts of first-century life. This makes it at once unsettling for the disciples involved and confusing. It was slaves' work to wash the dust-caked feet of the guests at a meal. It was certainly beneath the dignity of an honored teacher like Jesus. We should note that artists have sometimes been confused by John saying that Jesus took off his outer robe and tied a towel around himself. This has led some to depict Jesus as nearly naked, but what Jesus takes off is his hematia, the outer cloak that was wrapped around the body on top of a man's knee-length tunic. The tunic itself was still decent clothing, not underwear, but a simple tunic with no cloak on top was the dress of a manual laborer or a slave at work. The same role is implied by Jesus getting up from the table while the disciples recline around it. Free men didn't serve reclining guests. It was slaves who would come and go around the couches at a meal, taking care of the guests and host alike. So John makes it clear, Jesus here transgresses social norms in a shocking way. He abandons the expected script for an honored teacher's behavior, adopting the dress and actions of a slave. The Mediterranean world was, we have to remember, driven by highly stable social conventions and by a preoccupation with social status. Almost no one in this world celebrated the countercultural rebel the way we do in modern North America. So the disciples had no real category for Jesus' actions here. He was violating proper norms, compromising his dignity, and humiliating himself in the process. So why does Jesus do it? The foot washing is introduced by the statement that Jesus loved the disciples. So the norm-violating debasement of Jesus here is motivated by loving care. His violation of social rules is a way of expressing the depth and intensity of his care for them. Jesus is so full of love for these men and women, his friends and followers, that he's impelled to put his emotion into action and serve them recklessly without any regard for what's proper or dignified. Such an abnormal, undignified expression of love makes a demand on the person who receives it, too. Jesus' act doesn't follow the scripts for appropriate behavior, so there's no appropriate script for them to follow in receiving it. If the disciples let Jesus wash their feet, they'll be joining Jesus in stepping outside the social norms. Human beings have an instinctive fear of going off script like this because we become vulnerable. We lose what control we might have of other people's reactions to us. We risk being laughed at, rejected, shamed, And in the first century Mediterranean society, that kind of fear could be stronger than even the fear of death. So when Jesus breaks the rules and kneels down in front of a disciple to wash his or her feet, he's inviting that disciple out into that terribly vulnerable space. On the one hand, he's counting on their existing love and commitment to him. He's counting on it that when pushed, they too will be willing to risk this vulnerability in order to receive his expression of love. At the same time, by joining Jesus in this strange act, the disciples are in that moment deepening their bond with him. Because there isn't a script for this situation, Messiah washing feet like a slave, they have to improvise a response. How do they sit? What posture do they strike? What expression should be on their faces? Should they say something or remain silent? Will they appear too casual? Too formal? If they join in and just make up their own responses as they go, they have to trust that Jesus won't laugh at them. They have to trust that he'll accept them when there's no right thing to do that would make them acceptable. That loving gaze of Jesus invites the beloved into a space outside of the clear social scripts that usually let us predict how other people will respond. It invites us beyond the shelter of that social dance that normally protects us from rejection. It draws us into a place where there's no appropriate action that will make us acceptable, and so we have to depend on the sheer baseless acceptance of the other. As Jesus kneels in front of each disciple, he silently invites them to risk a deeper trust in which they come to depend on that sheer acceptance. And when Jesus proves trustworthy, when he doesn't laugh or make a joke of it, or shame them for the response or chase them away, they gain a new experience of being loved. This is actually the same kind of dynamic that animates so many of the team building and trust exercises that make us anxious at a lot of business seminars or youth retreats. It's the same social dynamic that can produce such an intimacy among people who do things like improv theater together. When we step outside our social norms, improvise a response to the other, and find ourselves accepted, we experience a trusting bond that addresses our deep needs for belonging and intimacy. Jesus' act was an even more powerful example of that same dynamic, because of how severely he deviated from their social scripts, and how profoundly ancient people relied on those norms for their security in the world. They risked a lot to receive Jesus' strange expression of love. But that also meant that the bond of trust and the experience of sheer acceptance was that much greater. Jesus' act was also more powerful because it was an expression of love. The disciples may not have understood completely what was going on, but John's framing of the scene encourages us to assume that they understood at least that this was about love. The disturbing strangeness of Jesus' act expresses the strength of his devotion to them. He's willing to look foolish, go this far outside the rules, because they're more important to him than any honor or shame. To receive such an intense declaration of love always demands vulnerability from the one who receives it. By letting Jesus wash their feet, the disciples are meeting his loving gaze and saying that they too love him enough that they'll do something crazy just to express it. And they find in the vulnerability of that returned love that Jesus was sincere. I'm not saying that John analyzed all of this so consciously. He wasn't a sociologist or a social psychologist. But I think that he felt this dynamic in the foot washing scene at an instinctive level. This is why Peter resists Jesus. He's not just being pompous and making a show of respecting Jesus' status. Norms are being broken. Lines are being crossed. Love is being expressed. And joining in to participate demands of Peter a terrifying level of vulnerability. So he flat out refuses at first. "You will never wash my feet," he says in verse 8. But Jesus won't be deterred. Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you will have no share with me." So Peter tries instead to domesticate Jesus' washing of his feet. He tries to change the act so that it conforms again to an established script. Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head, he says in verse 9. At first glance, this looks like Peter is being humble, is upping the ante on Jesus' act. What Peter actually does, though, is try to transform Jesus' destabilizing act into a rite of ritual purification. Israel's law called for a person to bathe before they could approach the temple sanctuary, and devout Jews would often perform ritual washings even when far from the temple, as an expression of their desire for closeness to God. So Peter asks Jesus to keep on washing enough of the disciples' body that the act will be recognizable not as a slave serving a guest, but as a kind of bathing for ritual purity. This would be something fitting for a great teacher to perform, and it would deflect Jesus' demand for such a threatening and intimate vulnerability. But Jesus won't be put off. He insists. One who has bathed doesn't need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. The language of bathing here suggests a total immersion, and at least in John's view, seems to refer to baptism. No ritual purifications are required to enter God's presence if one has already been baptized. But the focus here falls not on the details of that metaphor. Rather, it falls on Jesus' refusal to be sidetracked in his demand that Peter join in this norm-breaking expression of love. Already in verse 8, Jesus had said to Peter, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Many find a reference to baptism there as the necessary rite of entry into John's community. But at least in the context of the narrative here, that's probably not the main point. After all, this washing of feet seems to be deliberately distinguished from the bathing of baptism just a little further on. No, at that level of the story, Jesus seems to insist that the act of foot washing itself is indispensable for Peter and the others. Why? Because the relationship of love, of vulnerable intimacy that it draws them into, is the essence of being Jesus' disciple. As these followers continue to move deeper into trust, into faith in Jesus, this movement must progress in the direction of a radical and vulnerable love. We catch another glimpse here of how believing is for John an ongoing act. It's a continual movement into deeper trust, closer relationship with Jesus. And for Peter, already so close to his master, that still means continuing to let himself be drawn in closer still. So Jesus' washing of the disciples' feet is much more than just a symbol. Yet, the act also seems to be a symbolic anticipation of Jesus' debasement and degradation on the cross. We have, to begin with, John's introductory statement that Jesus loved the disciples until the end. The reference to the end is double-sided. In one sense, John is saying that Jesus loved them completely, perfectly. At the same time, though, talk about the end puts John's audience in mind of Jesus' end on the cross. Scholars have also noticed that when John says Jesus took off his cloak, he uses the same unusual language that we saw when the Good Shepherd lays down his life. Likewise, when Jesus puts on his robe in chapter 13, verse 12, this echoes the language for the Good Shepherd taking up his life again in chapter 10, verses 17 to 18. So the foot washing is also, for John, a symbolic foreshadowing of Jesus' crucifixion. But because Jesus' act has an immediate meaning as well, it doesn't just point ahead to the cross. The foot washing interprets Jesus' approaching death. It suggests that Jesus' crucifixion will somehow be like his washing of the disciples' feet. And parallels aren't hard to find. Crucifixion was a brutal punishment, reserved by the Romans for slaves and rebels. It was intended to dehumanize and debase the victim, their final torture put on display. It broke social norms for a teacher to wash his followers' feet. It would shatter all categories of shame and honor for Israel's Messiah to be broken and humiliated on a cross. But John is telling us that Jesus' crucifixion, too, was a demonstration of his love for human beings. In washing the disciples' feet, Jesus expresses that love and care so powerfully because he debases himself. His love for them is so strong that it overpowers any concern for propriety or for his own honor. The implication, by making this also a symbol of the coming cross, is that Jesus' crucifixion is likewise a demonstration of the depth of Jesus' love, of the Father's love embodied in the Son. The Messiah's love is so fierce that even crucifixion is not too great a price to express it. His very willingness to be degraded and dehumanized demonstrates the seemingly reckless depth of his love. But this also suggests that John saw the cross differently than modern Christians often do. We tend to think of the cross primarily in terms of sin, punishment, and forgiveness. When we think of the cross, we think of a courtroom. And there certainly are courtroom metaphors used in other parts of the New Testament. It's telling, though, that John has so far not called Jesus' death a payment for sin or a means of forgiveness. At most, he's alluded to it being a Passover offering, but that's not clearly a sin offering or a Day of Atonement offering. At this pivotal point, then, at the turn from the book of signs toward Jesus' departure and death, John frames Jesus' crucifixion as an expression of radical love. This can seem, at first, to reduce the significance of the cross. Is it just a way for the Father to tell humanity, I love you? Doesn't it do more than that? But maybe this response from us is a sign that we still haven't really understood what such a transgressive expression of love does to the person who receives it. In allowing their feet to be washed, the disciples were changed. They were made vulnerable and drawn into an immediate and personal relationship of trust with the Jesus who loved them. John seems to present the cross, at the outset of this book of glory, as a far more radical act of the same kind. It was the Father, in Jesus, saying, I'll even do this. I love you so much. For someone with a gut-level understanding of Roman crucifixion, the sight of the Messiah on the cross would have been perverse, incomprehensible. To accept a love this raw, this intense, this abandoned, was, for John, to be changed. Like Peter having his feet washed, the audience of John's Gospel is asked, in viewing the cross, to accept and receive a declaration of love that broke all the rules of reasonableness, of honor. The profound shame of the cross required those who received this declaration of love to let go their anchoring reliance on all of those rules and risk abandoning themselves to a crazy, overwhelming love from God. And as with Peter, John believes that when the audience lets go and receives Jesus' ultimate declaration, in that act, they enter a relationship of profound trust and dependence with the Son. This may not be the only thing John has to say about the cross. It's certainly not the only thing that's said about the cross in the New Testament. But it's crucial that for John, it's the first thing that he says clearly. And it challenges modern Christian readers to really listen to John on his own terms, rather than assuming we already know what the crucifixion does. The fourth evangelist has already talked about sin and the human need for forgiveness. But unlike Paul, maybe that wasn't the central problem that John thought was solved on the cross. After all, Israel had had access to forgiveness all along in sacrifice and repentant prayer. The implication here in the foot washing scene is that the problem solved on the cross might instead be how the Father could coax human beings open to experience the depth of his love for them in a restored relationship of dependence. The cross's purpose was, for John, first and foremost, to invite human beings outside the safety of our social scripts, outside the safety of the reasonable and the sensible, where they can form a relationship of intimate, trusting love with himself. In the next video, we'll see how Jesus not only performs this act of love for his disciples, but also calls them to participate in it to do it for one another and extend His love to them. Thanks for watching. I'm Ian Scott, and I'm Associate Professor of New Testament at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, Canada. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to click the like button and think about subscribing to my channel.